Hello again. So I'm just going to go over how I would answer questions over classical or operant conditioning on an exam. So what would I do if I got stuck and I wasn't sure, I could just get confused, my mind blanks? These are some tips and tricks you might want to use on your exam. And especially take advantage of this because you can write on your exams in this class, so that's super helpful. All right, 20 up here says, which of the following would have been considered or would be considered negative reinforcement? We'll start from the bottom up on these answers. It says a child who has been previously whining that they want candy becomes quiet after getting the candy. In this question, we're going to say, all right, they are reducing how often they whine. That behavior is decreasing because you are adding something to the situation. So remember up here, we're looking at negative reinforcement. I would say, all right, we have a negative and we have a reinforcement. So whenever we're going through our answers, we're going to look for something that matches this. We're going to look for a negative reinforcer. So over here we can say, nope, this is definitely positive punishment. This down arrow tells us we're reducing behavior. This plus sign shows me that we're adding something to the situation. So this tells us this is positive punishment. That's not the answer. So we know this one's not it. All right, receiving a traffic ticket for speeding. So you are adding something. You are adding. I would seriously just write these on your test. Makes it super easy. You are adding a speeding ticket. So immediately we can see that's not the answer. We're looking for some kind of negative reinforcer, but just for the sake of going through them and practicing, we obviously are wanting to decrease speeding, or at least I hope obviously. So you are adding something to decrease the behavior. Again, we're having positive punishment here, so that's also not the answer. Grounding a teenager who returns home after curfew. So returning home after curfew, that's a behavior we're wanting to stop. So again, we can already see that this is some form of punishment. It's not a reinforcer because we're making those behaviors go down. We want them to return home on time. So this is punishment here. Our arrows don't match. And then grounding the teenager. This is something that I would check with your professor with or ask for clarification on an exam, just because I had first interpreted it one way, but then the professor explained it in another. So there are two ways that people may confuse this sentence. It says grounding a teenager. Grounding, that could be adding a consequence. You are adding something. You're giving them something. So that could be seen as positive punishment. To hopefully reduce that behavior. But you could also say that grounding is limiting their access to things. So you're grounding them from the TV, you're grounding them from their cell phone. So you could also argue you're removing. You could also say you're removing something to decrease that behavior, meaning this could also be seen as negative punishment or punishment by removal. These two down here on the bottom, these are punishment by application because you're adding. So this one, we also know is not it because it doesn't match. And then this top one, it says taking an aspirin when you have a headache. So we know that's going to be our answer because it's our last choice. But why? When you look at it, remember we're looking for something that matches these arrows. We are taking an aspirin. We are increasing how often we take medicine because we are removing our headache. We are taking away the consequence. The consequence is our head hurts, we're in pain, we don't like it, and the behavior that we do to get rid of our headache is take medicine. So you are having that negative reinforcement. By taking away that headache, you're being reinforced every single time you take medicine because you'll want to take that medicine again. You are removing an unpleasant consequence. You're removing something that's unpleasant. So it's a negative reinforcement. If you're removing something that we don't like, that's going to make us happy and want to do it again. 16, right below, it says, whenever Vernon comes home too late on Saturday night, his parents refuse to give him his weekly allowance. Before I even read any further, I'm going to say they are taking away that weekly allowance. They are removing it. That's negative. And it says he's coming home too late. And his parents don't want him to come home too late. They're wanting to decrease how often he comes home late. So we're looking for something that matches those two symbols. So we have here negative, and then this down arrow tells us the behavior is decreasing, so it's punishment. And this is also called punishment by, and here we'll say, we know it's not a reinforcement. Application means to add, and removal is subtract. And if it's negative, we're subtracting. So our answer is punishment by removal. All right, and then we'll move over to number 10 on the bottom here. It says a naturally occurring stimulus leads to an involuntary response. Whenever I get stuck on these kinds of questions, I go back to writing out that equation, or so to speak. So I know off the bat, I'm going to have some kind of unconditioned stimulus, and there's a neutral stimulus, and an unconditioned response. I'm going to make that a lot smaller. Maybe, if it lets me. There we go. I'm trying to write that a little smaller. We have the, again, unconditioned stimulus plus a neutral stimulus giving us an unconditioned response. Then we have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. What we do here, it says this is looking for something that is naturally occurring, an involuntary response. So we know, since we're looking for some kind of stimulus, we know the answer is looking for some kind of stimulus. So we can cross these off. And then it says it wants something that's involuntary. It's something that's naturally occurring and is involuntary. So if it's involuntary, I keep saying involuntary, my bad. If it's involuntary, it's something that's naturally paired. These two things are naturally paired up. Our unconditioned stimulus will give us our unconditioned response. So again, we said we already knew it wasn't a response. We crossed that out. This in here, keep in mind, that means neutral. So that's something that's neutral. It's a neutral stimulus. These two things here, those have a natural, that natural relationship. So it's neutral in the middle. Neutral's in the middle, and these have that natural relationship. Try not to get those confused as best as possible. If you just think this is neutral, it doesn't really have meaning until it becomes conditioned. So we know we're not looking at this. We know we're not looking at this. It's not neutral. And we're not looking at something that's conditioned because it's going along with that involuntary response. That is our unconditioned stimulus. That is our answer. And last but not least, operant conditioning relies on. So remember we talked about classical conditioning and how that's something that happens on a relatively unconscious level. You're not thinking, as the example I gave in that video, oh, I see this house, I'm going to start drooling now. No, that's an unconscious process that happens. You are pairing the meal in the house, and then you start drooling later when the meal is removed. So that's relatively unconscious. But operant conditioning, this is based on our consequences. This is based on reinforcement and punishment. We know that we can do a certain behavior, or we can remove or add something in a situation to affect that behavior. So really, we know it's not involuntary because that's more unconscious. And these are just our kind of answers that are meant to throw us off game. So really, this is voluntary behavior. Operant conditioning is something that you are willing to do. You are voluntarily doing that for the certain reward, punishment. You're adding something or removing something. I hope that helps whenever you're taking your test. Don't forget, you can write on your tests, and I know this looks really crazy, but if you just remember, matching up your arrows over here on an exam, that really helps. Just knowing or writing out, negative and positive and keeping everything straight, it'll just help you work through the problem, and especially if you're trying to get through a lot of questions fast. So if you ever have any questions, always feel free to contact your ULA or your professor or SLA. We're always happy to help.